Hello, it's May 30th and this is the New Arab Weekly podcast from the New Arab in London. Each week we look at the biggest stories from the week and ask what happened and what does it all mean? Joining us to unpack the last 7 days in the Middle East, we have investigations editor Andrea Iotti.
Hello.
And senior journalist and editor Nada Osman.
Hello.
Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of news. On with the show. Our first story comes from you, Nada.
This week, the Israeli military launched attacks on Rafah, defying international calls not to. The attacks, which targeted an area filled with forcibly displaced Palestinians, left at least 60 dead and caused fires to engulf tents and families in them. Footage online showed people being charred to death and streets covered in dead bodies. Ismail al-Thawbata, Director General of the Gaza Government Media Office, spoke to reporters the following day and said, the Israeli occupation army had designated these areas as safe zones and had called on citizens and displaced persons to go to these areas. When the displaced persons fled to these areas, the Israeli army then committed massacres and executions there.
This seems like a real devastating attack. Yet another devastating attack in Rafah. Nada, fill us in. What happened? What was hit? How many people were killed and injured?
Yeah, so this feels like we've covered many similar attacks over the past almost 8 months now. This particular attack occurred around 10 p.m. where Israeli jets dropped bombs on a makeshift camp in Rafah. It was in the Tal al-Sultan neighborhood and it ended up causing a fire that burned around 14 tents. Overall, 45 Palestinians were killed that evening, and then another 21 Palestinians were killed again on Tuesday in a separate attack. The attack on the 26th of May ended up causing a huge fire with people burnt inside their tents. There was no warning prior to the attack. Families were just praying and eating when they heard this explosion. And several eyewitnesses said that the tents were melting around them. People were being burnt alive. The footage that came out of the attack were very graphic. I think there was one
really difficult to watch.
Yeah, there was one viral video of a Palestinian man carrying the body of a child without a head, which obviously caused global outrage. The New Arab spoke to one survivor, a man named Samir, who told us the place was immediately set ablaze. There was nowhere to escape. They were hearing the screams of people inside the tents who just didn't know which way to leave. Obviously, these tents are made out of nylon. They catch fire very easily. He came out and described seeing bodies all over the floor. So around 249 other people were very seriously wounded in this fire. A lot of severed limbs and burns, as you can imagine.
The Director General we just heard from said, he said it was a safe zone. Israel claims to have set up sort of safe zones in humanitarian areas. Was this one of a safe zone? Nowhere is safe.
Yeah,
in Gaza or in Rafah, but
I think that's important to point out. The fact that we're even having this debate or this conversation seems a bit ridiculous sometimes because we've seen in the past when Israel does designate an area as a safe zone, it means nothing. They're still being bombed and attacked there. But this particular displacement camp was located in a humanitarian zone near a UN storage facility. And like I said before, there was no orders to evacuate the area before it was attacked. The Gaza's government media office have said that Israel dropped 7 2,000-pound bombs and missiles on this camp. So,
they're massive.
Yeah.
2,000 pounds is for context is huge.
Yeah, there's no way this could have just been a very precise attack, like Israel said, just to target Hamas officials or Hamas members.
There was reports that this attack came after Israeli soldiers were captured by Hamas fighters. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so the attack came just after a Hamas spokesperson said on Sunday evening that they had captured Israeli soldiers. They didn't say how many, but they said that they were taken in Jabalia, which is in North Gaza. Israel denied the claim, but Hamas's armed wing released footage which showed a person with blood on them being dragged along in a tunnel. They also shared photos of kind of military uniform and a rifle. It's not clear who the person was and what their condition was.
In terms of Rafah, we've been talking now for weeks, even in the newsroom, even on this podcast, about an assault on Rafah. Where are the Israeli soldiers now in Rafah? Are they deep inside Rafah? Are they on the outskirts of Rafah? What is the situation there?
It seems like they're scattered all over. The Israeli army announced that they're sending more troops into Rafah, and they already have some tank stationed at Al Auda roundabout, which is a key location in central Rafah. They've also said that they've taken control of the buffer zone along the Gaza-Egypt border.
There's still, Nada, there's still an intense need for humanitarian aid in Gaza. News this week that a new crossing had opened. Where is the crossing? And what does it mean for aid? Does it mean that now it's going to be able to reach those in need, or is it going to be, sadly, more of the same?
I mean, there's been a lot of conversations about aid and different crossings and all these sorts of things, but the bottom line is that the situation is not really improving. And just today, a young child died from malnutrition because of the lack of aid and resources. In terms of this new crossing, it's the Karam Abu Salim crossing, and it's being used as a replacement to the Rafah crossing, which has been shut for 3 weeks now. Palestinians are obviously still going through very catastrophic conditions which are only deteriorating. And aid is still a major issue, and it doesn't seem like this new route is going to be, easier for aid to get in. Israel is claiming that it's allowed hundreds of trucks to enter, but the UN has said that it's just too dangerous to take the aid from the other side. So it's kind of counterproductive. And they estimate that less than 1,000 trucks have entered Gaza through this crossing so far.
Where's this crossing between Israel and Gaza?
Yeah.
So then they're still going to be dealing with the problems of, we've seen recently, of hardline Israelis blocking the routes of aid trucks going into Gaza.
And it's also worth mentioning that there's a lot of fighting in the area as well. So it's not safe to get aid through that.
It's been sort of advertised quite heavily a while back, and then it all went quiet, and then it's suddenly all come up again. The US pier that they proudly announced that they were going to build, and that was going to be the solution to everybody's problems. So long as if you mean by everyone, you mean no one. The US pier, it was in the news. What happened with that?
This pier cost around $320 million. It's a temporary pier that's used to transport aid into Gaza. And less than 2 weeks after it was built, it broke apart.
Brilliant. $320 million well spent there.
It just feels like
Good job, lads.
The worst planning imaginable, extremely unsustainable, and just pointless. And time and time again, we've seen these kind of very pointless efforts with the aid dropping, which actually ended up killing people on more than one occasion. And now the US seems to be doing something just as ridiculous. So several aid organizations have slammed this pier, which can only operate in certain conditions. A lot of these aid groups have called it just a distraction and an unviable option. It took 2.5 months to build, and the US claims that 1,000 metric tons of aid were delivered through it so far, but aid groups are still saying that this is just not sustainable and it's not an alternative to land routes. It only allows 150 trucks of aid to come in through a day when actually thousands are needed every single day to meet the needs of around 2.2 million people. It's definitely just ridiculous, to be honest. And
I mean, that
there are land routes that can be used, and they're just not.
As that 320 million, it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's also absolutely dwarfed by the billions that the US has sent in aid, military aid to Israel. I mean, the gulf between those two numbers is huge.
Yeah.
Also, sort of related to fighting in Gaza, there was a pretty grim prediction made. What was that, Nada?
So a senior Israeli official said this week that he expects the war to continue on for at least 7 more months. And they added that this time is needed to kind of ensure the destruction of Hamas and military capabilities. And, you know, we're almost 8 months into this war on Gaza now, 36,000 people dead, of them over 14,000 children, and another 81,000 wounded. Like, the numbers are just huge, 10,000 under the rubble. And still, you know, it's very clear that this is not about Hamas or destroying Hamas. Israel plans to continue this on.
Another 7 months.
Yeah.
It's unbearable. Andrea?
I was just about to say, like, they probably also miscalculated this themselves, because I remember earlier on when they launched the offensive, like, there was an Israeli official who said that it was going to take them, like, I think it was 6 or 7 months. Like, this is going, like, even beyond
Israel
what they
Israel has continued
expected.
also to increase their war budget. I think the war has caused a lot of divisions inside the Israeli government as well. So the whole thing just seems very poorly calculated, with no real aims in sight. So it's just catastrophic for everyone, really, and also it's causing a lot of discontent among Israelis.
And Nada, do we think that the Rafah offensive might have breached international law?
I mean, absolutely. Legal experts are saying that it amounts to war crimes and a breach of binding decisions of the ICJ. Now, if we look at international law, it states that parties to the conflict are obliged to respect the principles of distinction and proportionality. Now, when we look at what this means, it means that they're only permitted to target people who are not civilians, so military personnel. And all of the victims of the Rafah attack were civilians, but mainly women and children. The law also states that Israel is not allowed to attack in a way that is expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury, or damage to civilian objects, which again Israel has violated. And it's very clear that, you know, the attack targeted an area which was very densely populated with people who have already been displaced several times. And it comes after Israeli officials have been, you know, warning and talking for weeks about threatening to attack Rafah, despite several international calls not to. And Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, said that the attack was a blatant defiance of international law and system, and she called on Israel to face sanctions and suspensions of agreements, trade, partnership and investments over this attack.
I think that'll be a great thing to happen. I'm not going to hold my breath either. Second story this week, that's you, Andrea.
Yes. On May 24, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, issued its third order concerning the situation in Gaza, Palestine. The court ordered Israel to halt its offensive on Rafah, which was launched on May 7. The court believes that Israel's latest military operation could result in the partial or total destruction of the Palestinian community in Gaza. In other words, into a genocide. The presiding ICJ judge, Nawaf Salam.
The court considers that, in conformity with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
Andrea, as a way of sort of maybe some background to all this, what did the ICJ say? Why did they say it? Why have they spoken now?
I think, the wording of the order is quite clear, but there's been the wording of the order is basically to immediately halt the Israeli military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group conditions that could bring about its physical destruction. So that's basically genocide. Yeah. So they basically telling Israel you should stop the ongoing offensive. Now there has been an ongoing the media coverage, and also some of the judges they didn't help in framing this as sufficiently clear, because even some of the judges, at least one judge who voted in favor, say that then the court order was unclear, whereas the South African judge, we have to remember that this was a South African initiative. The South African judge, for example, said clearly, there was a BBC piece, and they were saying it's just telling them to stop the offensive. It's quite clear. A bit of framework, maybe a context maybe would help. This is the third order. There were two others, one in end of January, one end of March. Two other orders were like basically not, this one is the first, like, which is specifically about Rafah.
Yeah.
Like those were like, the first like was like basically about Israel plausibly committing genocide. It was worded as such, and Israel being told to take all necessary measures to ensure that this would not happen, and that includes, of course, humanitarian aid and making that humanitarian available within the besieged strip. And the second one was sort of like similar to that. It's just like reiterating like access to aid, and again
What does this actually mean for Israel then, and their offensive on Rafah? Do they have to stop now? Is this legally binding? And what happens then if they don't stop, which it seems like they're not going to?
I mean, the order in principle is legally binding, as Israel is a UN member state, but nothing would happen without enforcement mechanisms and political
which don't
pressures.
exist, really.
Which don't exist. And basically, South Africa will need to take the case to the UN Security Council, and we all know that the US would have veto power there. So again, legal, historical, moral significance, but no enforcement mechanism, so nothing is going to happen.
What did Israel say about this?
Their response was actually, I think that there was an article in the Guardian saying that they used a comma in the statement to argue that the meaning was different. Basically, they put out a statement saying, the foreign ministry said that they would stop if there was if what they were doing was leading to genocide, but they believe this is not. So basically,
they would say that, I suppose, wouldn't they?
It's going to extreme lengths to justify what was being done.
It's I don't know. It's entirely absurd. I think like it's just we're getting to the stage where they're saying, we can go ahead because this is not going to be a genocide. I'm telling you, this is how.
Sticking with international courts. There was a pretty worrying report out this week about one of the prosecutors of the ICC, different to the ICJ. The ICC, the International Criminal Court. Andrea, what happened there? Sort of fill us in.
So basically, there was an investigation done by two Israeli progressive outlets, like Local Call and Plus 972. Sorry, 972. And then another one published by The Guardian, and they covered two aspects of the same story. So a 9-year surveillance operation by Israeli security conducted on the International Criminal Court members, like basically judges, but also the chief prosecutor, Palestinian rights group, like basically providing evidence for the proceedings and for the investigations of the International Criminal Court, UN officials. And on top of that, the former head of the ICC, so Ben Sudan, this was what The Guardian covered, which was who was, according to some confidential Israeli sources, stalked, threatened, including
harassed. Harassed as well.
Harassed. Yeah. Basically, all of this to prevent the opening of a full criminal investigation into Israeli war crimes, basically.
Now, obviously, I'm sure you've both heard that Karim Khan, who is the current ICC chief prosecutor, has recently sought arrest warrants against some Israeli leaders, including Netanyahu. And that seemed to have kind of startled the Israeli leaders a bit and kind of caused some panic amongst them. Do you think that, this is going to change anything? And like even the ICJ warnings, do you think that's it might affect anything?
I mean, I would say no. There should have been so many points at this conflict that should have stopped.
It feels
Israel
like
in their stop,
yeah,
in their,
it
in
feels
their
like
tracks,
there's been
and
a
it
lot
hasn't.
of turning points, or what you think should have been turning points. For
right.
example, the WCK aid workers that were killed, or the first time a hospital was bombed.
Yeah, and it doesn't.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that particularly with the arrest warrants, the application for arrest warrants, that is significant. That is really significant, because I think it, unlike say, the attack on aid workers, unlike the attacks on hospitals, is a real event on the international stage and within the international community, rather than being completely localized within Gaza. So I think that is significant in that respect. But again, all these things are reliant, like the ICJ, they are reliant on other countries enforcing these international mechanisms.
I mean, based on that report as well, do we think that we're going to see Israeli officials kind of coming after Karim Khan as well, in the same way that the former head of the ICC was stalked, harassed?
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I think it'll be maybe particularly after this, it could be quite a bold move by them. Because Netanyahu, I think, called Karim Khan one of the great anti-Semites of modern times, which is, I mean, a pretty bold statement to make, I think. I feel it may be more of that sort of stuff. But they don't seem to have got the response from the international community maybe they're expecting, which is, let's go after the ICC. They seem, to the international community's credit, they do seem to have stuck with the ICC maybe more than the Israelis expected, which is, nice to see, I think.
If I may add something, the ICC has a history. I think this is quite significant. I mean, not regardless of the fact whether they're going to go after Israeli leaders or not, but the ICC has a history that has been perceived for quite a long time to going after only rogue dictators who are at odds with the West, especially the ICC. I'm talking about the Serbian war criminals, Omar Bashir. Now that they're going after the Israelis,
Africans specifically, almost. Yeah, I think we mentioned it last week on the podcast that an unnamed Western leader called Karim Khan and said, "This isn't for the likes of Israel. This is for African leaders.
Exactly.
This isn't for this isn't for us. This is for them." Nada's explained what's happened in Rafah over the past week. With those sort of unfolding events, the notion of this sort of unwavering, unconditional support for Israel by the US has come into the spotlight again. What have the US said about what's going on in Rafah?
We've heard National Security Spokesman John Kirby saying that there would be no change in U.S. policy, even following the Israeli strike that we just heard from Nada reportedly resulted into all these casualties among civilians.
The president has been very clear and very direct about what our expectations are for Israeli operations in Rafah specifically, but in Gaza writ large. We don't support, we won't support a major ground operation in Rafah, and we've, again, been very consistent on that. And the president said that should that occur, then it might make him have to make different decisions in terms of support. We haven't seen that happen at this point.
Why not have him come?
This was National Security Spokesman John Kirby talking about basically the U.S. stance following the launch of the Rafah offensive, and especially the Israeli offensive on Rafah, and especially the latest massacre committed on Sunday. In terms of the opposition to the Rafah offensive, this has been clear in U.S. political circles that we've been debate officially. Even Biden was quite clear. So it was supposedly a red line.
Yeah.
There is inconsistency, of course. The inconsistency is pretty clear in terms of weapons supplies. Fine, there's been an exception with some heavy bomb shipment imposed early in May, but that was more of an exception. Yeah. We haven't seen this so there's a question about deterrence. What do you do then when they cross these red lines?
You mentioned U.S. red lines. They said an assault previously, before this, a few weeks ago, that an assault on Rafah would be a red line for the U.S. We are now seeing an assault on Rafah. Or are we, according to the US? Has a red line been crossed, or why hasn't a red line been crossed for the US?
So according to Kirby and the US, basically this is not a major operation. They're saying like that they're not given the units involved. This appear to be like a small thing, which of course,
tell the people of Rafah that, yeah.
Exactly. If you look at history, I'm just going to say like red lines are flexible. Politically, they have been flexible in Syria. In Iraq, they didn't need any red lines. They just went in. So this concept of red lines is something that move across. Yeah, it's a
especially considering that the US is still, Israel is still sending in, more troops into Rafah. And technically, the attacks on Rafah started a few weeks ago, and it seems very incremental.
Yeah.
So.
I fear I know the answer already, Andrea, but is there any hope after this, recent massacre in Rafah of a change in US policy?
I think it's already become like, I don't know even what the right word would be, embarrassing, impossible for them to show that they have any leverage on Israel at this stage. It got to the point where, I think even before, with the exchange between Biden and Netanyahu, it was clear that on the two-state solutions, it was clear that, now the U.S., they don't have leverage on, unless there's no military deterrent, right?
No.
So without a military deterrent, you're not going to, fine diplomacy, red lines, but they're not in a position to affect the situation on the ground, and diplomatic pressures have not yielded any result. And they don't want to. Of course, military deterrence is not an option.
Our final story comes from me this week, and we're staying certainly in the Rafah area. On Monday, May 27th, armed clashes erupted between Egyptian and Israeli forces on the Rafah border. Initial reports suggested that Egyptian forces had opened fire on Israeli troops, with Israeli forces responding. While the death toll from the incident was low, just 2 Egyptian soldiers were killed, the clashes further ratcheted up tensions between the two countries. Speaking from Beijing during a forum of Arab leaders and Chinese officials in the Chinese capital, President of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, said this: I call on all relevant parties in the international community to fulfill their moral and legal responsibility and stop the brutal Israeli war. I also call on the international community to immediately provide for a long-term humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip and to end the Israeli siege and to stop any attempt at forcing Palestinians to forcibly flee their land.
So what actually happened during the attack?
The attack took place at the Rafah crossing. We've heard about that today. The picture isn't 100% clear. Our best idea of what happened was that Israeli forces were fighting in the area on the by the border with Palestinian forces. There were sort of shooting in numerous directions. It would seem that some of that shooting went over the border. This then prompted Egyptian security forces to take protective measures, it would seem, and respond to the source of the shooting. Egyptian Armed Forces spokesman Garib Abdel Hafez stated that the Egyptian Armed Forces were investigating the shooting. A high-level source told the New Arab, an unnamed high-level source, told the New Arab that, quote, Israeli soldiers returned fire and then fired warning shots before fleeing the scene. There have been no reported Israeli casualties as of yet, but one Egyptian soldier was killed during the clashes and a second one later died of his injuries.
And what did each side say after the clashes?
Not a great deal. Israeli forces issued a pretty vague statement saying that, quote, Israel had been in touch with the Egyptian side to coordinate investigations into the shooting incident. That's really about it. Al Arabi Al Jadid, our Arabic sister publication, reported on Tuesday that both Egypt and Israel had agreed to maintain the status quo and downplay the incident, essentially. Neither the Egyptian narrative nor the Israeli narrative lay blame about who shot first. In terms of a sort of a firm response on this, to be honest, the most firm response actually came from the Egyptian people. On Tuesday of this week, we had hundreds of people in Egypt attend the funeral of 22-year-old Abdullah Ramadan, who was the Egyptian soldier who was killed in the clashes. It was claimed on social media that he was denied a full military funeral.
Yeah.
It was also claimed that the Egyptian army was represented at the funeral with the attendance of an army major. With the responses from these clashes, there seems to be a real sense that neither side want this to go any further at all, and they want to sort of clamp down on this immediately.
They're definitely trying to keep it quiet.
We've heard throughout this conflict, since October, Israel's bloviated incredibly hard about a war with Iran, a war with Hezbollah, a war with the Houthis, or anybody in that sort of quote unquote axis of resistance. The US doesn't want that. I don't think Israel really wants it either, but they're happy to sort of take the rhetoric. I think the idea of any sort of larger conflict between Israel and Egypt is so unpalatable for everybody, including the Israelis. They're not looking for a war with Egypt either, unlike the likes of Iran.
So this incident took place along the Salah ad-Din corridor. Just for the benefit of the listeners, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's a narrow strip of land, about 14 kilometres in length. It runs the entire length of the Gaza Strip's border with Egypt. It was established in 2005, after the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. It's all part of something called the Philadelphia Accord. Sometimes it's also known as the Philadelphia Corridor. That's what the Israelis called it. As part of those accords, it was agreed that Egypt would be allowed to deploy up to 750 border guards along the corridor to sort of patrol it. The Palestinian side was controlled by the Palestinian Authority until 2007, when Hamas took over in the Gaza Strip. The general idea was it would be a sort of a mechanism to restrict and prevent the transfer of weapons into Gaza. That was how it was sort of dreamed up, and that was the idea with the Israelis withdrawing from Gaza in 2005. They didn't want to see lots of weapons go in. During that time, Egypt has engaged in flooding tunnels across the border, numerous throughout the history of it. This is not the first time we've heard about the Salah ad-Din corridor during this conflict. Back in December of last year, Netanyahu, he told the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Security Committee that Israel would want to take full control over it, and that they would also want to impose a buffer zone inside the Gaza Strip to have even greater control over that area.
What could we say about the current status of Egyptian-Israeli relations?
It's getting worse, steadily getting worse generally. For decades, but strap in for history, folks. For decades, the relationship has broadly been governed by the Camp David Accords, signed in 1978 between President Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, the then Israeli Prime Minister. This then led to a peace treaty, 1979, between Israel and Egypt. That essentially removed Egypt as a military force from the region. Before, when we had the 6-Day War and the like, you had combined Arab forces attacking Israel. This peace treaty meant that Egypt would not be taking part in any future attack of that kind. And, an attack of that kind never happened again, because any attack of that nature would require Egypt. Since the Camp David Accords, the relationship has developed pretty well. It's most characterized by sort of the sharing of intelligence and security information and some political cooperation. There hasn't been the same. It's not like the normalization agreements we've seen with the UAE and Morocco and that like. It's not that, but they do have some cooperation. I mean, we heard reports just after the October 7th attack about how Egyptian Egyptian intelligence officials had warned the Israelis and said something's going to happen, guys. So they do share information of that sort. Since the start of the war in Gaza, things have been getting worse between Egypt and Israel. Much of this sort of worsening is due to the Israeli pressure that they've been putting on Egypt to take in refugees. Israel is seeking to essentially push vast numbers of Palestinians from Gaza into the Sinai desert with the idea that they would never be able to return. Most people will call it ethnic cleansing.
Yes, the repeat of the Nakba.
Yeah.
I can jump in on that. Because as investigative unit, we're also working on something related. It's worth remembering that Palestinians in Egypt, especially Palestinians from Syria and Egypt, they lack access to education. They're not even able to obtain residency permits. So imagine another flood, like adding more Palestinians into Egypt into these conditions. What will generate? Let's remember what are the conditions of Palestinians in Egypt now.
I mean, really, really bad. I think this is an idea that is like permeated from the very beginning of the war. We had it in late October of last year. Netanyahu tried to get France, Germany, and the United Kingdom to essentially diplomatically press Egypt to accept refugees, unsuccessfully, I might add. These countries weren't interested in pressuring Egypt like that. For Egypt, they have just said from the very beginning that this sort of mass displacement would be a red line for them. They've adapted a strategy of containment strategy, as they call it, which is essentially trying to ratchet up international pressure on Israel. So they're sort of less trying to do it themselves, but rather they're pressuring other international countries to put pressure on Egypt, to put pressure on Israel, sort of on their behalf, as it were. There are a few very good reasons why Egypt does not want mass numbers of, what would be, could be up to 2 million refugees. If I think Israel got its way. Security, they believe that having such a huge number of refugees would create security instability, which any good paranoid regime as Egypt is doesn't want. Money.
Egypt's going through its own economic crisis at the moment.
Going through its own economic crisis, and even if you had every single international NGO in Egypt working with Palestinians, working with them and providing them with shelter and food and things, there will still be a cost for Egypt, which they, A, don't want to spend, and B, they can't spend it because they haven't got any money. Mainly, the biggest problem for them is complicity. Is if they as they see it, not unfairly, if they agree to take in huge numbers of refugees, Palestinian refugees from Gaza, they will be viewed, particularly by the Egyptian people, as being complicit in the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, which they don't want to do. Having said all that, there have been some unconfirmed reports that there was one in October that the Egyptian government was reported to be thinking about a US offer to write off $160 billion of Egyptian debt in return for hosting 100,000 refugees from Gaza.
And do you think this strategy is working?
I mean, somewhat. They haven't had vast numbers of refugees. There's been a number of people who have fled from Gaza into Egypt, generally a vast cost for themselves, thousands and thousands.
I think it's also worth highlighting that they're not exactly, like Andre said, they're not exactly in the best conditions. I mean, a lot of them have been struggling to, for example, enroll into schools or get jobs, and there's been no follow-up, on their condition. No,
not at all. But, I think the Egyptians would say, for their part, that this whole sort of containment strategy has worked because they haven't had hundreds of thousands, millions of Palestinians flood into Egypt. They've also sort of generally done very little to help Palestinians in Gaza. They've certainly done, as we mentioned, very little to help Palestinians in Egypt. They've done even less to help Palestinians in Gaza. There is a problem to this strategy, which is the Egyptian people are very unhappy about it.
But they're also not allowed to properly express that.
Well, I mean, you see, you got huge popular support for Palestine in Egypt and amongst the Egyptian people. There's been, with the financial stuff, there's been massive pressure in Egypt amongst, the Egyptian population is just a pressure cooker of problems and struggles at the moment. Plus now we have, they're sort of, got the war in Gaza, which is adding to that. We've had protests against what's happening in Gaza in Egypt, which have been followed by the Egyptian police arresting people.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah,
like heavily surveillance. And
But then they've been followed by more protests saying, release these people. And then those people have been released because, strangely, for the Egyptian regime, have cowed under some pressure and released these people. Recently, particularly with the assault on Rafah, when that started, we've seen increased criticism of Israel within the Egyptian media, which, let's be honest, comes from the Egyptian regime. So there is a sort of message change happening. One thing that certainly didn't help was that there was a massive Israeli flag flown on the Salahdin corridor.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Which a video of that went viral across Egypt and annoyed a lot of people. I think sort of just to wrap up, Egypt, the Egyptian regime is walking an incredibly fine line throughout all of this, and I think for them, falling either way runs an incredibly serious risk for them.
I think it's already too late, for a lot of people.
I think it could be too late. I think certainly the Egyptian regime still believes there is a way out of this for them. Time will tell. A few other stories that have been out this week. One here, War Cabinet Minister Gantz, that's Benny Gantz, calls for 7th of October inquiry. War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz has issued demands for the establishment for a States Commission of Inquiry into the military failures prior to Hamas's attack on southern Israel on October 7th. There were pretty clear problems with the Israeli response to the attacks on October 7th, but also the lead up where we mentioned earlier about how they were warned about this. Do we think that if this inquiry happens, it could be effective? Or is this, considering it's coming from Benny Gantz, who is all set to take over as Prime Minister and boot Netanyahu out, is this just political grandstanding?
I think it's just a desperate attempt by Israeli leaders to look like they're doing something and save face. There's a lot of anger at them from Israelis who have been calling for a ceasefire and who've been calling out, corruption in the Israeli government. And of course, we've got the families of the captives in Gaza who are saying that the government is making no real attempt to bring them back home. So, it's also worth noting that within the Israeli government, there's a lot of kind of divisions over this investigation and even if it should happen and the timing of it. So definitely, I think it's just a political decision.
Yeah, I do agree. It looks like a political maneuver. I'm not Israeli political analyst, but given the profile of Benny Gantz, another thing I would add is also that an inquiry should happen. It should be an international inquiry. If you look into if this is as far as I understand, they're basically calling for an Israeli inquiry into what happened, and given the even the precedence of Israeli military officials not been held accountable for long history of violations within occupied Palestinian territories and so forth. I wouldn't honestly rely only on an Israeli investigation.
We've not seen the results to any of the Israeli investigations that have reportedly taken place in Gaza since October. We've had countless hospitals bombed, we've had the Flower Massacre, we've had the Al Ahli Hospital Massacre, we've had several which Israel has promised investigations, and we've not not seen anything come out of that.
No. Another one here, Iranian Nobel laureate outraged by UN tribute meeting for Raisi. An Iranian activist has hit out ahead of a UN General Assembly meeting convened to pay tribute to Iran's former president Ibrahim Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash on May 19th. Given Ibrahim Raisi's record, which is coated in blood and hangings of Iranians, do you really think the UN should be doing this? I don't recall the meeting to pay respects for, Colonel Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein. I mean, so is this good?
I think of course, I understand the perspective of the Iranian dissident, who I think is also jailed at the moment, who wrote actually, who basically was denouncing all of that, and it's outraging and all of that. But is the UN actually, it's a body that represents states and leaders and many of them are actually authoritarian leaders. I'm not surprised about this. That's what I'm.
I should mention the Nobel laureate in question is Najat Mohammadi. She's a jailed Iranian human rights activist and Nobel laureate.
I mean, I definitely can see why human rights activists are annoyed about this. Following his death, we saw Iranians celebrating in the streets of Iran and London and other parts of the world. I
saw a cake on social media. Did you see this?
No, I didn't see that.
I saw a cake on social media this week, which
Raisi cake.
A Raisi cake with a helicopter buried in it. I don't know.
It says a lot.
I don't know if it's true or not, but
it says a lot.
The caption was a party in Tehran. But who knows? Another one here. Saddam Hussein. Second mention in the podcast this week. Saddam Hussein to be featured in Call of Duty video game. Former Iraqi President Saddam Hussein is set to, quote unquote, appear as an antagonist in the forthcoming installation of the Call of Duty Black Ops video game, slated to be released later this year. It's all set during the first Gulf War. There are people still alive. There are Iraqis still alive. There are soldiers who fought for Western forces who are still alive, and experienced the first Gulf War, which wasn't nice for anyone really involved. Is this in bad taste, do we think?
I think definitely. Call of Duty, in my eyes, is very problematic, especially from their depictions of the Middle East and the people from the region. I think in 2021, they also showed torn pages from the Quran scattered on the floor with blood splattered on them, which caused a lot of outrage. So they don't exactly have the best track record.
No.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think there are precedents, right? And especially with all this, I don't even know if it's only Call of Duty, but all these video games where the US military will be glorified, and so, it's problematic in itself, no, isn't it?
I think problematic is probably the right word. I will also make a prediction. This will make Activision Blizzard, who are the publishers and makers of the game, hundreds of millions of dollars. That's my prediction. Some great stuff out on the New Arab's website this week. Nada, you've picked out something for our listeners to read?
Yes, my pick of the week is from the opinion section. We have an article titled Rafah Bloodbath. Now we know why Israel banned Al Jazeera. The article explores how Israel has a long history of censoring the media and how Gaza is currently the deadliest place in the world to be a journalist.
Andrea?
My pick of the week is an analysis or in-depth. It's called, the headline is How UN Aid in Syria is increasingly going to regime cronies by Hannah Davis. So it analyzes the complex dynamics between sanctions and aid provisions, in which basically the same individuals, Syrian individuals who will be under sanctions, will be profiting from certain UN contracts in the context of humanitarian aid.
That's a good one, that. I've got one from the opinions desk. Strict separation is not the answer for Palestine and Israel. This is by former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis. He writes that separating Jews from Palestinians is incompatible with human rights because it implies mass transfer or being treated as an underclass. Well worth a read there from the former Greek finance minister. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the New Arab Weekly. This week we were joined by investigations editor Andrea Iotti and senior journalist and editor Nada Osman. We'll be back next week and every Friday after that. You can subscribe to the New Arab Weekly on Apple, Spotify and wherever else you get your podcasts and be notified when a new episode drops. You can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Until then, if you have any questions for us or stories that you would like us to cover, drop us an email, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com, or find us on social media @TNA Podcasts. Don't forget to follow the New Arab on Facebook, X and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.